The Great Oxygen Catastrophe, when Earth's air nearly ended life. Documentary for Sleep Tonight. We're traveling back to an Earth so old and unfamiliar that the sky would have looked dull, the oceans would have carried a greenish tint, and the air would have been, for most modern creatures, completely unbreathable. For billions of years, life lived quietly in a world without oxygen, tiny organisms drifting through warm seas, feeding on chemistry rather than air. And then, slowly, almost innocently, a new kind of life began to change everything. It learned how to drink sunlight. And as it did, it released a waste product that would transform the planet and nearly end the world that came before it. This is the story of the Great Oxygen Catastrophe, the moment Earth's air became dangerous, and life, for the first time, was forced to evolve or disappear. Take a slow breath, settle in, and let's begin. Imagine arriving on Earth so far back in time that almost everything familiar would be missing, not just the shapes of plants and animals, but the very feel of the world. The sunlight would still fall across the planet, gentle and steady, but it would land on a surface that looked raw, young, and restless. Continents, if they existed in recognizable forms, would be smaller, reshaped constantly by heat and movement. Volcanoes would be more common, breathing gases into the air. Storms would sweep over wide oceans that covered most of the planet, and the seas themselves would behave differently, chemically rich, heavy with dissolved minerals, and often tinted in strange, subdued colors. And the air would not be something you could breathe, not because it lacked freshness, but because it lacked the ingredient modern life takes for granted: oxygen. For a very long time, an almost unimaginable stretch of time, Earth's atmosphere held little to no free oxygen. Instead, it was made mostly of nitrogen, with varying amounts, of carbon dioxide and water vapor, and traces of other gases that would feel alien today. Methane may have been present in much higher concentrations than it is now, along with hydrogen sulfide and other volcanic and biological gases. If you could somehow stand there safely on a shoreline under that ancient sky, you might notice that the light itself feels different. Not necessarily darker, but muted, filtered, depending on exactly how much methane and haze existed at different times. The sky could have looked less blue and more pale, or even slightly tinted, like a world perpetually on the edge of dusk. The ocean would be the main stage, because the ocean was where life lived. Life already existed, quietly, modestly, endlessly, long before the air became breathable. It did not roar or stride or fly. It drifted, it clung, it divided and multiplied. It lived in thin films and invisible clouds, in warm shallows and deeper basins, in pores of rock and along the edges of undersea vents. These were anaerobic organisms living without oxygen. For them, oxygen wasn't a necessity. It wasn't even a helpful bonus. It was, in many cases, a threat. That can be a strange thought to hold in the mind, because we associate oxygen with vitality, bright lungs, clear skies, the clean snap of a flame. But oxygen is reactive. It wants to combine with things. It pulls electrons. It corrodes. It breaks down delicate chemical structures. To organisms that evolved in a world without it, oxygen could be like an invisible acid, something that damages membranes, disrupts proteins, and fractures fragile molecular systems that had never needed to defend against it. So the earliest biosphere didn't long for oxygen. It built its entire way of being around its absence. Energy came from other sources, from sulfur compounds, from hydrogen, from iron, from chemical gradients where one kind of molecule met another. In places where hot water rose from the planet's interior, loaded with minerals, life could harvest the chemistry like a slow, steady fire. In shallow seas where sunlight reached the bottom, life could also tap into light, but at first, not in the dramatic, oxygen-producing way we know from plants. It's easy to picture early life as primitive, but primitive can be misleading. These organisms were extremely sophisticated in their own context. They had survived for ages under harsh conditions: ultraviolet radiation, volcanic upheavals, meteor impacts, and climate swings. They were masters of adaptation on a microscopic scale, and the oceans themselves were chemically different enough that you could almost think of them as a separate kind of world. In today's oceans, oxygen is mixed throughout the surface layers, and iron, while present, is not freely dissolved in large amounts because it reacts and precipitates out. But in an anoxic ocean, iron can remain dissolved more easily. So ancient seas may have carried vast amounts of dissolved iron, drifting invisibly in the water like potential, like stored possibility. If you stirred those waters with your hand, you wouldn't see iron as metal, of course. You would see water. But you would be moving through a broth of chemistry that modern oceans no longer hold in the same way. A chemistry waiting for the right spark to change it. For a long time, the world stayed in this mode. An Earth with life, but without oxygen in the air. An Earth where biology operated quietly and invisibly, mostly in the water. An Earth whose dominant life forms would not recognize our atmosphere as home. And then, in the gentle rhythm of day and night, sunrise, noon, sunset, something happened that would rewrite the planet's story. It wasn't a single moment. It wasn't a thunderclap. It was more like a new habit spreading slowly through the world, so slowly that no single generation would notice what was beginning. Somewhere in the ancient ocean, a group of microbes learned how to do something extraordinary with sunlight. We call them Cyanobacteria, and their achievement is almost difficult to appreciate because it has become the background of our lives. They developed a form of photosynthesis that used water as a source of electrons. Not sulfur, not iron, not some rare chemical. Water, which means they learned to split water molecules, pulling them apart and using sunlight as the driving force. It's a deceptively simple statement, but in reality, it's a remarkable chemical trick. Water is stable. It doesn't easily fall apart. It takes a clever system to pry it open. But these microbes did it, day after day. They captured light. They directed that energy into an internal chain of reactions. They liberated electrons to power their metabolism and, in the process, released hydrogen and built sugars, chemical stores of energy and structure. And what was left behind, what drifted out of them as a kind of exhaust, was oxygen. At first, this oxygen was not a triumphant, world-changing gas rising into a blue sky. At first, it was simply a waste product, leaking into the water around them. If you could have seen it, you might have watched tiny bubbles gather in warm, shallow mats where these microbes clustered. Soft, layered communities that formed along coastlines and in tidal flats. Over time, these microbial mats could build structures called stromatolites, layered towers and mounds made of trapped sediment and biological growth, shaped slowly by life itself. Stromatolites are among the oldest widely recognized fossils on Earth, and some still exist today in a few specialized places. quiet reminders that this ancient way of life is not entirely gone. In those early days of oxygenic photosynthesis, the oxygen didn't escape into the atmosphere in any meaningful way. The planet had too many ways to absorb it. Earth was, in a sense, oxygen hungry. The oceans were filled with dissolved iron, and oxygen loves to react with iron. Volcanic gases rose from the interior, reduced compounds that would readily combine with oxygen. Minerals at the surface, newly exposed and chemically reactive, would seize oxygen molecules and bind them into oxides. So the oxygen produced by cyanobacteria would appear, and then be consumed. It's like lighting a small candle in a room full of thirsty darkness. The flame burns, and immediately the darkness drinks the light. Not because light isn't real, but because the room is not ready to hold it. For a long time, Earth was not ready to hold oxygen. The cyanobacteria kept making it anyway. They did not need to intend anything. They did not need foresight. They simply did what worked. Sunlight was abundant, water was abundant, and the chemistry of their cells made use of both. As long as they could survive and multiply, oxygen would continue to seep into the world. And so, day after day, the oxygen trickled outward, meeting the ocean's dissolved iron like a slow-motion collision. Where oxygen touched iron, it changed it, transforming dissolved iron into solid particles of iron oxide. Rust, essentially, though not in the familiar flaky way we picture on old metal. It was rust as sediment, rust as a rain of tiny particles falling through the water column and settling on the seafloor. Over long spans of time, this process helped create immense deposits known as banded iron formations, layered rocks that record ancient pulses of ocean chemistry. Dark and reddish layers, repeating like stripes, hinting at cycles of oxygen production and consumption, of changing conditions in the sea. To think about it in a calm, sleepy way, you can imagine the ocean breathing, not with lungs, but with chemistry. Inhale, oxygen is made in sunlight. Exhale, oxygen is swallowed by minerals and metals, again and again. And while the planet performed this slow chemical breathing, life continued to evolve in the background. The world was not frozen in place. It was transforming, gradually, subtly, relentlessly. The oxygen itself, even before it accumulated in the air, began to reshape local environments. In shallow microbial mats, oxygen levels could rise during the day as photosynthesis ran at full strength, then fall at night when photosynthesis stopped, and other organisms consumed oxygen through respiration-like processes or chemical reactions. These were tiny daily cycles, micro-worlds experiencing dawn and dusk, not only as light and darkness, but as shifts between oxygen and its absence. Over time, some organisms began to develop ways to tolerate oxygen's reactivity. They evolved protective enzymes. They learned to neutralize damaging byproducts. Some even learned to use oxygen in their own energy systems, because oxygen allows a much more powerful extraction of energy from food molecules than many anaerobic processes can manage. But in the beginning, oxygen was not a resource. It was more like weather, an environmental factor, a chemical presence that could appear in some places and vanish in others. And Earth's atmosphere, above all of this, remained mostly oxygen-free. Picture the boundary between ocean and sky as a kind of lid. Oxygen molecules could cross it, of course. Gases exchange between sea and air all the time. But if oxygen entered the air in those early periods, it would still be quickly destroyed by reactions with volcanic gases and other reduced compounds. The atmosphere itself acted like another sponge, soaking up oxygen before it could build. So the world's first oxygen did not instantly create a breathable planet. Instead, it spent a long time being used up, locking itself into rock, rusting the sea, transforming minerals, and quietly exhausting the planet's capacity to erase it. And this, in a way, is one of the most important ideas to hold gently in the mind. The Great Oxygen Catastrophe was not just about biology. It was about Earth's chemistry finally reaching a threshold. For ages, oxygen was produced and removed as fast as it appeared. But the sinks, the vast reservoirs of oxygen-consuming substances, were not infinite. Iron could be oxidized, minerals could be transformed, the chemical budget of the planet could shift. Meanwhile, cyanobacteria didn't stop. If anything, they spread. They occupied more sunlit zones. They formed more mats. They created more stromatolitic reefs along ancient shorelines. They turned light into chemical work with a tireless simplicity. And the oxygen kept coming. You can almost imagine it accumulating the way snow accumulates during a long, quiet storm. At first, each snowflake melts on contact with warm ground. The land absorbs it. The ground drinks it. But the snow keeps falling, hour after hour, day after day. Eventually the ground cools. Eventually the surface can no longer melt everything that arrives. Then, at last, a thin layer remains. Then a thicker one. Then the world wakes up to a new landscape. In the same way, oxygen kept arriving. At first, it vanished. Then it lingered briefly. Then it began to remain. Even before oxygen filled the atmosphere, the mere act of producing it was already altering the planet in subtle, cascading ways. Methane, for instance, interacts with oxygen. In an increasingly oxygen-influenced world, methane can be reduced. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, so shifts in methane levels can affect climate. As oxygen chemistry expanded, the planet's temperature balance may have changed, perhaps contributing to periods of intense cooling and widespread glaciation. So the cyanobacteria, in learning to use sunlight and water, weren't just changing the ocean. They may have been changing the sky, the climate, and the very stability of Earth's surface conditions. And yet, they remained small. No eyes, no voices, no ambitions, just cells and sunlight. It's one of the most humbling truths in Earth's story. The planet can be restructured by the tiniest forms of life, simply by persistence. If you let your mind drift over a calm, ancient sea, you can picture those sunlit shallows as a living film, microbial communities stretching across stones, along coastlines, over submerged sediments. The water is warm. The light is gentle. Day after day, oxygen is released like a soft exhale. The oxygen rises a little, meets the sea's chemistry, disappears into rust and stone, but it keeps happening. And slowly, without drama, without announcement, Earth moves toward the edge of a transformation so immense that it will one day make breathing possible. And, for much of the life that came before, make survival suddenly difficult. For now, though, we're still in that long beginning, the period when the world is mostly quiet and mostly anoxic, when oxygen is still a newcomer, still being absorbed, still finding its way into every crack of chemistry it can reach. A world before blue skies. A world before forests. A world where life's greatest revolution begins as something almost tender, sunlight touching water, and tiny cells learning how to turn that meeting into energy. leaving oxygen behind, molecule by molecule, as the planet slowly, patiently changes. For a long while, the oxygen that was being made in sunlit shallows never had a chance to become a true part of the world's atmosphere. It was born, and then almost immediately taken. If you picture oxygen as a pale, invisible dye released into a vast ocean, the early Earth was like water already filled with things that loved to bind that dye the moment it touched them. Oxygen is eager to react, and the young planet was full of partners for that reaction, especially in the sea. The ancient oceans carried a secret that modern oceans don't carry in the same way. Iron, dissolved and abundant, drifting through the water as quietly as salt does today. In oxygen-poor conditions, iron can remain dissolved as ferrous iron, iron in a form that stays mixed into seawater, rather than settling out. It can travel far from the places it emerges, spreading across basins and shelves, present everywhere and nowhere, invisible until chemistry changes. And chemistry was beginning to change. Each day, in the surface waters where cyanobacteria lived, oxygen slipped into the sea like a soft exhale. It moved outward from microbial mats and floating communities, mixing with surrounding water, spreading thinly. But it didn't travel freely for long, because oxygen and dissolved iron are drawn to each other with an almost inevitable force. When oxygen meets ferrous iron in seawater, it transforms it into ferric iron, iron that no longer wants to stay dissolved. Ferric iron forms tiny particles that clump together and settle, slowly falling through the ocean like a faint, rust-colored snow. It's a gentle image, almost peaceful, a slow rain of mineral dust drifting down through greenish water, layering the seafloor grain by grain. But on a planetary scale, this was enormous. This reaction didn't happen once. It happened continuously, over immense spans of time, across wide stretches of ocean, whenever and wherever oxygen touched iron-rich water. It meant that the first great home of oxygen wasn't the sky, it was stone. Oxygen was being locked away into minerals, pulled from the water and bound into oxides, becoming part of sediments that would harden into rock. The planet was storing the evidence of oxygen in its own crust, as if hiding the change inside itself. And this is where those ancient striped rocks come in, the banded iron formations. If you could fast forward through deep time and then hold one of these rocks in your hands, you'd see layers, reddish bands, and darker bands repeating in subtle rhythms. Each band is like a page in a quiet diary. It tells you that oxygen appeared in the ocean, reacted with iron, and left behind a deposit. Then conditions changed. Then it happened again. The banding suggests cycles, perhaps seasonal, perhaps linked to climate swings, perhaps tied to ocean circulation, perhaps to biological booms and slowdowns. However the exact rhythm played out, the result was the same. Over and over, oxygen's earliest global impact was to rust the sea, and the sea, in response, became a kind of chemical battlefield, though battle makes it sound sharp and sudden. In truth, it was slow. It was steady. It was patient. Imagine the surface ocean as a thin layer warmed by sunlight, lively with microbial growth. Beneath it, deeper water, colder, darker, heavier, with dissolved minerals. Between them, a shifting boundary where mixing sometimes happens and sometimes doesn't, depending on winds, temperatures, currents, and the shape of the ancient seafloor. Now imagine oxygen being produced in the upper layer. In some places, it might build up a little during the day, creating small oxygen oases. pockets where local conditions become briefly different. In those oases, new kinds of chemical reactions become possible. Certain microbes might find opportunity there, while others feel stress and retreat. But beyond those pockets, the bulk of the ocean remained ready to swallow oxygen as soon as it arrived. Because iron was only one of the planet's oxygen sinks, there were others, vast and hungry. Volcanoes, for example, didn't just shape the surface with lava. They shaped the air and sea with gases, many of them chemically reduced, meaning they were primed to react with oxygen, hydrogen, methane, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, gases that could rise from the interior and immediately consume oxygen by combining with it. In a world like that, oxygen trying to accumulate is like snow trying to settle on a warm stove. Every molecule that appears is quickly erased by chemistry. And then there were rocks themselves. Fresh basalt on the seafloor, newly formed from volcanic activity, contains minerals that readily react with oxygen. When oxygenated water touches those minerals, it alters them, oxidizing iron in the rock, changing the mineral structure, locking oxygen into the crust. Even on land, what little land was exposed, weathering reactions could consume oxygen as soon as it was present in air or water. The surface of the young planet, constantly renewed by tectonics and volcanism, offered an endless supply of fresh material for oxygen to react with. So oxygen had many fates. It could rust iron in seawater. It could react with volcanic gases. It could oxidize rocks at the seafloor. It could alter minerals on land. Every pathway was a sink, an oxygen drain. And as long as those sinks were deep enough, oxygen could be made for a very long time without ever building up in the atmosphere in a lasting way. This is one of the most soothing, strange truths of deep time. Big transformations can be delayed not by a lack of cause, but by the planet's capacity to absorb change. Life was producing oxygen, yes, but Earth was, for a while, excellent at erasing it. Still, the erasing was not infinite. Each reaction that consumed oxygen also changed the world in a lasting way. When iron rusted and sank, it removed dissolved iron from seawater and stored it in sediments. When volcanic gases reacted with oxygen, they were transformed into different compounds. When rocks oxidized, their minerals shifted to new chemical states. The oxygen sinks were being filled, slowly, quietly, like reservoirs that are deep at first, but not bottomless. And as these reservoirs filled, subtle transitions began to appear. Over time, ocean chemistry would shift from being uniformly oxygen-free to becoming more layered and varied. In some regions, especially where nutrients supported strong microbial photosynthesis, the surface might become more oxygen-influenced. Elsewhere, deeper waters could remain anoxic, rich in iron or sulfur. The ocean might not have become oxygenated all at once. It likely developed zones, layers where oxygen was present, and layers where it was absent, separated by moving boundaries where redox chemistry happened, places where reduced and oxidized forms of elements met and transformed. These redox boundaries can be thought of like invisible shorelines inside the sea, frontiers where the rules change. On one side of such a boundary, iron remains dissolved and mobile. On the other side, it precipitates and falls. On one side, certain microbes thrive. On the other, they struggle. And because oceans are always moving, these boundaries would shift with currents, seasons, storms, and long-term climate changes. The planet's chemistry would have felt alive, not in a conscious way, but in the way a breathing organism feels alive. Rhythmic, responsive, always in motion. Meanwhile, the oxygen production continued, daylight after daylight. It's worth lingering here, because this is where the scale of time becomes almost dreamlike. We're not talking about years, not even thousands of years. We're talking about stretches of time so long that entire mountain ranges could rise and erode while oxygen chemistry slowly advanced. During these vast spans, the oceans were, in effect, being cleaned of their dissolved iron, at least in the surface zones where oxygen could regularly reach. The rust snow would continue to fall, building thick layers of iron-rich sediment on the seafloor. And if you could hover above the ancient ocean in imagination, you might picture a strange beauty. Shallow waters glowing softly with microbial life, and beneath them, the slow descent of mineral particles, the quiet turning of water into stone. But the consequences were not just geological, they were ecological. As iron was removed from surface waters, the availability of certain nutrients and trace metals could change. As oxygen oases formed, new metabolic pathways became possible. As oxygen stressed anaerobes, they retreated into refuges, deeper muds, isolated basins, oxygen-poor pockets where the old world still held on. So life began to rearrange itself around oxygen's uneven presence. Some organisms adapted by developing defenses, enzymes that could neutralize oxygen's reactive byproducts, repair systems that could fix oxidative damage. Others found ways to avoid oxygen altogether, taking shelter in places where it couldn't easily reach. And in the background, there may have been an atmospheric drama unfolding, one that connected ocean chemistry to climate. Methane, likely abundant in the early atmosphere, acts as a strong greenhouse gas. If oxygen begins to react with methane, methane levels can fall. If methane falls, the planet can cool. Cooling can encourage ice to expand. So as oxygen became more common, especially in the upper ocean and near the surface, Earth's climate could have been nudged toward instability. Shifts in greenhouse balance, temperature drops, perhaps even episodes where ice spread far beyond the poles. This connection is delicate, complex, and still studied, but the general idea is soothing in its grandeur. The breath of microbes in shallow seas might have helped alter the warmth of the entire planet. And through all of this, oxygen still struggled to become a permanent resident of the sky. Because even if some oxygen escaped the ocean and entered the atmosphere, the air itself contained oxygen-consuming forces. Reduced volcanic gases venting into the atmosphere would react quickly. The surface of the land, when exposed, would weather in ways that consumed oxygen. Lightning and sunlight could also drive reactions that moved oxygen into other forms. The atmosphere, like the ocean, was a sink. So oxygen's journey toward accumulation required something like a tipping point. Not an instant tipping point, more like a slow leaning of the scales. As more iron was locked into sediments, as more rocks became oxidized, as more reduced gases were converted, the planet gradually lost some of its ability to erase oxygen as fast as it was made. And when that erasing weakened just enough, oxygen began to linger. Perhaps at first, it lingered only in certain places, coastal waters where microbial mats were dense, surface layers where sunlight-driven oxygen production was strong, regions where circulation trapped oxygen near the top. But lingering matters, because lingering means time. Time for oxygen to spread a little farther before being consumed. Time for more oxidative reactions to occur in new regions. Time for oxygen-tolerant organisms to gain an edge. Time for the atmosphere to start, very slowly, changing its character. There is something almost meditative about the way this transformation unfolds. It's not a story of sudden conquest. It's a story of persistence meeting planetary chemistry. The planet wasn't resisting oxygen with intention. It was simply full of reduced material, and oxygen is the kind of molecule that rushes towards such material. Earth was chemically young, and oxygen was, for a while, a guest who kept being ushered out the door. But each time oxygen was ushered out, it left a trace behind: rusted sediments, altered rocks, transformed gases. The door, gradually, began to stay open, and as iron continued to fall out of seawater, the world's oceans would slowly lose that ancient iron-rich character. The sea's color, its clarity, its chemical feel, these could all change over deep time as iron was removed and buried. If you like, you can picture the planet's memory being laid down on the seafloor, layers of minerals settling, compressing, hardening, becoming archives, the ocean floor becoming a library of reactions. In those layers, oxygen is recorded, not as a word, not as a number, but as a transformation. Iron, once dissolved, now fixed in stone. Chemistry, once mobile, now still. And above those layers, the surface ocean continues its gentle work. Sunlight arrives. Microbes stir. Oxygen seeps out. The oxygen rises, spreads, reacts, over and over. And somewhere within this long, slow rhythm, Earth approaches a moment when the balance shifts enough that oxygen can do something new, not merely rust the ocean, not merely vanish into rock, but begin to accumulate in the air, quietly at first, almost shyly, until the atmosphere itself becomes part of the story, and the world that once swallowed oxygen starts finally to hold it. At some point, after the oceans had spent ages swallowing oxygen into rust and rock, the balance began to tilt in a way that could no longer be hidden. It wouldn't have looked dramatic from a human point of view. No sudden flash across the horizon. No single day when the sky turned into something else. Instead, the change would have arrived the way dawn arrives when you're not watching closely, quietly, gradually, and then all at once you realize the world has a new color. Oxygen began to linger, not just for minutes in a sunlit pool, not just for a day in a coastal mat, but long enough to leak outward, long enough to drift into places it hadn't reached before, long enough to start becoming part of the background conditions of the planet. And in that moment, when oxygen stopped being a local curiosity and started becoming a global presence, Earth crossed a boundary. Because oxygen is not a gentle molecule, it is energetic, it reacts, it reshapes what it touches. To modern life, that reactivity is the reason oxygen is useful. It allows us to pull immense energy out of food. It powers muscles, brains, warmth, motion. But to the older world, the world that had evolved for billions of years without oxygen, its reactivity was the beginning of danger. You can think of it like this. Early life had built itself out of chemistry that worked best in an oxygen-free environment. Many of its enzymes and cellular structures were never designed to handle oxygen's aggressive tendencies. When oxygen enters such a system, it can start generating reactive byproducts, highly charged fragments and molecules that bump into delicate cellular machinery like invisible hail. Membranes can be damaged, proteins can unravel, genetic material can be struck and broken. Not all at once, not in a single violent blow, but through a steady accumulation of stress. So as oxygen spread, many organisms faced an unfamiliar problem. The environment itself was becoming chemically hostile. For countless generations, the world had been predictable in a very deep way. The oceans were anoxic, the air was anoxic, life's strategies were built on that foundation. And now, slowly, that foundation was shifting under everything. This is why the event is remembered as a catastrophe. Not because life nearly vanished entirely, life is incredibly resilient, but because an entire global style of life was suddenly under pressure. The places that had once been safe, shallow seas, coastal sediments, the warm sunlit edges of the ocean, were the very places where oxygen appeared first and strongest. In a strange twist, the most productive habitats became the most dangerous for oxygen-sensitive organisms. If you imagine the ancient ocean as a layered world, then the upper layers were beginning to change character. Oxygen could build there, especially during daylight, and with time, it could persist through the night and remain present over longer stretches. That meant the surface ocean stopped being a universal refuge for anaerobic life. So the old biosphere did what life always does when the surface becomes harsh. It retreated, downward into mud, into deeper waters where oxygen struggled to penetrate, into pores within rocks, into isolated basins, stagnant zones, and sediment layers where the chemistry remained reducing, oxygen poor, friendly to the ancient ways. These refugees weren't glamorous, but they were stable. They were the shadows where the old world could survive. And it did survive. Even today, anaerobic organisms still exist in oxygen-free environments, deep sediments, animal guts, certain wetlands, deep subsurface rocks. They are living echoes of that earlier Earth, reminding us that the Great Oxygen Catastrophe didn't erase anaerobic life. It rearranged it. But while the old world retreated, the new world expanded. Because oxygen didn't just threaten cells, it also unlocked new possibilities. If an organism could evolve even a modest tolerance for oxygen, ways to neutralize its damaging byproducts, then oxygen became something else entirely, a powerful tool. Aerobic respiration, which uses oxygen to extract energy from organic molecules, yields far more energy than many anaerobic pathways. It's like the difference between living off candlelight and living with an electrical grid. More power, more flexibility, more capacity for complexity. So oxygen was both poison and treasure. That dual nature created a split in the living world. On one side, organisms that fled oxygen and survived in sheltered places. On the other, organisms that adapted, tolerated, and eventually learned to use it. And as oxygen continued to spread, the second group gained room to grow. It's likely that this transition was messy, full of local collapses and local recoveries, ecosystems shifting, microbial communities reorganizing, entire metabolic networks becoming less common, while new ones emerged. But because the cast of characters was microscopic, it all happened quietly, without any visible drama from afar. The catastrophe would have been written in chemistry rather than in spectacle. The atmosphere itself was changing too, and that change may have carried climate consequences. Earlier, methane may have played an important role in keeping the planet warm. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas, and in an oxygen-poor atmosphere, it can persist longer. But as oxygen increased, methane would have been more easily destroyed through chemical reactions. If methane levels fell, the greenhouse blanket could thin. And a thinning greenhouse can mean cooling. In some scenarios, this cooling could have been severe, cool enough to encourage widespread glaciation. The idea is not that oxygen decided to freeze the planet, but that oxygen's chemistry may have shifted the atmospheric balance of heat-trapping gases in a way that pushed Earth into a colder state. So the Great Oxygen Catastrophe may have been, in part, a story of cold. A planet that had known long warm eras might have entered intervals where ice expanded, where oceans cooled, where the surface became harsher, not just chemically, but physically. And again, life would respond not with panic, but with persistence, finding niches, sheltering in pockets, enduring until conditions shifted again. Meanwhile, oxygen was also transforming the ocean's elemental cycles. When oxygen appears, it doesn't just react with iron, it changes the behavior of many elements: sulfur, nitrogen, carbon, and various trace metals. New chemical forms become stable. New reactions become possible. For example, sulfur chemistry can shift dramatically as oxygen increases. In oxygen-poor environments, sulfur often circulates in reduced forms. As oxygen becomes more available, oxidized forms like sulfate become more common in seawater. That shift matters because sulfate can support certain kinds of microbial metabolisms that were previously limited, opening doors to new ecological interactions. In other words, oxygen didn't simply add one new ingredient to the world, it rewired the pantry. And rewiring the pantry changes what kinds of meals life can cook. Yet for all of oxygen's promise, it remained dangerous in the short term to many organisms. The immediate effect for oxygen-sensitive life would have felt like losing ground. The comfortable zones of the surface ocean became patchy and unreliable. The ancient biosphere's familiar landscape narrowed. Think of it like a coastline during a slow flood. At first, the water rises a little and recedes. Then it rises again and stays higher. Eventually, the old shoreline is gone, and what used to be dry land becomes an underwater memory. For anaerobic organisms, oxygen was that rising water, except it was rising invisibly through the chemistry of the sea and air. The shoreline of safety moved deeper, darker, and more hidden. And once oxygen began to accumulate in the atmosphere in a lasting way, the flood became planetary. Even low concentrations of oxygen can have outsized effects because oxygen is so reactive. It can alter soils, change the availability of nutrients, and transform the chemistry of surface waters. So you don't need an atmosphere like today's to start reshaping the world. You just need oxygen to stop being instantly erased. As that happened, Earth became a planet with a new kind of surface: oxidized rocks, less dissolved iron in the oceans, new chemical gradients, a different balance of gases in the sky, and life, still microscopic, still patient, began, slowly, to explore the new rules. Some lineages evolved defenses, enzymes that mop up reactive oxygen byproducts, repair systems that patch damage, biochemical strategies that treat oxygen not as an invader, but as a manageable force. Over deep time, those defenses could become more refined, more efficient, and eventually integrated into everyday cellular life. And once oxygen became something an organism could survive, it could become something an organism could exploit. This is where the catastrophe begins to blur into an origin story, because the same oxygen that made the old world dangerous also laid groundwork for the future, far future, of complex life. The air, once oxygen began to persist, did something else as well. it started to make ozone. Ozone is a molecule made of 3 oxygen atoms, and it forms when oxygen in the upper atmosphere is split by energetic sunlight and recombines in new arrangements. Ozone absorbs much of the sun's harmful ultraviolet radiation, acting like a protective veil around the planet. This matters so deeply that it's hard to overstate. Without protection from intense UV radiation, life faces constant damage, especially on the surface. In the early world, with little ozone, the upper ocean and land surfaces would have been more hostile. Sunlight not only warming, but also injuring. The sea itself provided shielding, which is one reason life could thrive there for so long. But with more oxygen, and therefore more ozone, the planet's surface became safer. Not immediately safe in the way we experience it now, but safer than before. Gradually, subtly, in a way that expanded the boundaries of possibility. And as oxygen reshaped the atmosphere, it also reshaped how energy could flow through living systems. Energy is the quiet currency of complexity. If you want bigger cells, you need more energy. If you want specialized structures inside cells, you need more energy. If you want multicellular life, cells cooperating, communicating, dividing tasks, you need much more energy. Aerobic metabolism offers that kind of energy. So in the long aftermath of the oxygen shift, the stage was being set for a different kind of life. Not just in terms of chemistry, but in terms of scale and organization. Over time, Earth's biosphere could support organisms with higher energy demands. The environment could sustain more elaborate ecological webs. The planet could begin to move extremely slowly toward the conditions that would one day make animals possible. But it's important to feel how long that one day really is. Even after oxygen began to accumulate, it likely did so in steps, rising, plateauing, rising again, because Earth's system is full of feedback loops. Oxygen production depends on biology. Oxygen sinks depend on geology and chemistry. Both depend on climate, nutrients, ocean circulation, and the arrangement of continents. So the oxygenation of Earth was not a straight staircase upward. It was more like a tide chart. Rises and pauses, surges and stillness, long stretches where the world seems stable, then a shift that redefines everything again. And during those long stretches, life continued its quiet experiments. Some organisms may have become better at producing oxygen. Others became better at tolerating it. Others became better at avoiding it. In a way, the planet learned to live with oxygen by dividing its environments. Oxygen-rich zones near the surface, oxygen-poor zones in sediments and deep waters, each hosting its own communities. Earth became a world of layers, and life found ways to inhabit every layer. As the oxygen story continued, another quiet revolution would eventually become more likely: the rise of complex cells. Simple cells, prokaryotes, can do astonishing things, but complex cells, eukaryotes, carry internal structures and compartments, specialized machinery, and in many cases the ability to become multicellular. A key feature of most eukaryotic life today is the mitochondrion, the cell's powerhouse, which uses oxygen to generate energy efficiently. There is strong evidence that mitochondria originated long ago when one cell took in another and a deep partnership formed, turning what might have been prey into a permanent resident. This kind of energy-boosting partnership makes far more sense in a world where oxygen is available, because oxygen-based energy production becomes a central advantage. The details are complex, and the timing is studied carefully. but the broad pattern is serene and elegant. Oxygen makes high-energy living more viable, and high-energy living makes complexity more affordable. So oxygen's arrival didn't just change the air, it changed what life could afford to be. And that, in time, changes everything. There is also a gentle irony here. Oxygen made the planet more flammable. Fire is a child of oxygen. With enough oxygen in the air, combustion becomes easier. Much later, once plants arrive and begin building abundant dry biomass, fire becomes a new ecological force. But the possibility of widespread fire begins, in a distant sense, with oxygen's ancient accumulation. Oxygen also changed the color and character of the land. Oxidized minerals often take on reddish and brownish tones, and many of the rocks and soils we associate with earthy colors are shaped by oxygen chemistry. The surface of Earth, its skin, became more oxidized, more rust-toned, more like the familiar world we walk upon today. The oceans, too, moved away from that iron-rich ancient state. As dissolved iron became less common in oxygenated waters, the chemistry of seawater shifted. The great era of banded iron formations, those enormous deposits built from oxygen meeting iron, began to wane as the ocean's inventory of easily oxidized dissolved iron was reduced, at least in many regions. The planet, in other words, was leaving behind its earlier self. Yet even as oxygen created opportunities, it didn't instantly create a world full of animals. Between oxygen's first accumulation and the later flourishing of complex multicellular life lies a vast stretch of time, hundreds of millions of years and more, during which Earth continued to adjust. Oxygen levels may have remained relatively low compared to today for long intervals. Oceans may have had complicated oxygen patterns, oxygenated at the surface, anoxic in deeper zones, variable across different basins. Complexity does not rush. It tests, it repeats, it waits for conditions to stabilize enough for new strategies to pay off. So the aftermath of the Great Oxygen Catastrophe is best imagined not as an immediate victory of better air, but as a long, slow settling of a new equilibrium. A planet learning how to host oxygen, life learning how to endure it, then life learning how to use it. And somewhere inside that deep settling, an entirely new future becomes possible. If you like, you can picture Earth after the initial shock as a world that has taken a deep breath and is now holding it for the first time. Oxygen is in the air, perhaps still modest, still far from modern levels, but present enough to matter. The upper atmosphere begins forming a protective haze of ozone. The surface becomes gradually less brutal under sunlight. The chemistry of oceans and rocks continues to oxidize, creating new cycles and new boundaries. In sheltered sediments, the old anaerobic world continues, quiet, persistent, alive in darkness. Above it, in oxygen-influenced waters, new metabolisms find room to expand, ways of living that can tap into oxygen's energy. Food webs can begin to support organisms that demand more power, and far, far down the timeline, the same oxygen that once threatened life becomes the scaffold for life's expansion, supporting larger bodies, more intricate cells, and eventually a planet where movement, perception, and complex ecosystems can unfold. It's a beautiful kind of transformation because it's not a story of simple progress. It's a story of cost and consequence, of loss and opportunity braided together. Oxygen arrives as a waste product of sunlight-eating microbes. It spreads, and for many organisms, it is deadly. It reshapes climate, seas, rocks, and sky. It drives retreat, extinction, and reinvention. And then, so slowly it feels like drifting, oxygen becomes the quiet supporter of the world we know. Blue skies, protective ozone, energetic metabolism, and the distant possibility of complex life. Even now, as you breathe in and out without thinking, you are participating in that ancient aftermath. Each breath is a small personal echo of a planetary shift, a reminder that the air around you is not just there, not just a background. It is an ancient invention of life itself, an invention that once nearly ended a world, and then, over deep time, became the doorway into another,